Welcome to Jack Theology. I'm here as Dr. Matt Murphy with my friend Dr. Kevin Young. Welcome, Kevin,
Good to
to
see
the
you, man.
show. Good to see you here. Be back. We are actually live today, not just fake live.
Not just fake
Uh,
live, but real live. Here
real
we go.
live. Just want to welcome everybody. Hopefully, um, as you watch this, you will share it. You'll check in. You'll leave some comments for us on the podcast, wherever you listen from. That would help us. So thank you for those that have done that, and all of our listeners and followers. We are in week 4 of kind of looking at the different pillars of evangelicalism, and this week the last pillar is on Christian action and evangelism and social work, which is a hot topic.
To say the
There's a
least,
lot.
right?
I mean, I feel like every generation of Christian, I was thinking about this, like, has a debate on how this is supposed to play itself out. And I think, there's the old revivals versus, what became like evangelism explosion. They're kind of are coming up in the ministry. It was missional versus attractional, or and that sort of conversation. Um, I think now it's a conversation around, and maybe you have some insight on this too, is evangelism. I think what I'm seeing now, evangelism and social justice is just about getting someone out of hell, versus evangelism is inviting people to have heaven here and now. Um, and I see those as kind of the two differing kind of viewpoints on this. I don't know if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, I think we might have talked about this a little bit when we talked about conversion, salvation, but, growing up in a highly fundamentalist context, it was all about keeping people out of hell, eternal conscious torment. And so I think that theology for us minimized the idea of the kingdom here and now. It was always the kingdom, that was to come. And so this idea of caring about the living situations that somebody was living in, the oppression maybe that somebody was facing, being involved in social action or social justice wasn't it wasn't a high priority for us because it was all about the soul and salvation. And so this idea of what people were living in the here and now was just it wasn't even something that wasn't our focus, but it was almost I think seen as being counterproductive to the mission. Why would you focus and spend your energy there on helping somebody in the here and now when there's this greater perceived need?
Yeah, I can remember being at Cedarville actually and doing we
We're,
do
we're
kind of
naming names.
yeah.
For those who don't know, Matt and I's paths, well, our paths didn't cross at Cedarville, but our
uh,
educational paths crossed
yeah.
at
We
Cedarville.
we just missed each other. You graduated, and then that fall I came in as a freshman. So
It would have been too much for Cedarville to handle for both of us to be there at the same time. So
um
we passed the baton.
yeah. No, well, I was part of this or student club called Open Airs, where we would go do evangelism, like door to door kind of thing. We would mostly go to coffee shops and interrupt people working and try to witness to them about Jesus. And that came out of like this evangelism explosion idea of like the door to door kind of sales method of evangelism. And I remember being struck. I still can picture the kid's face. It was like a teenage kid that I was talking to about Jesus, and he kept like rejecting Jesus. But
How could he?
because his story was one of like, it was just difficult. Like, how could he accept a God that, like, his life was just in shambles and his upbringing was rough, um, and I'm trying to give all the answers from the scriptures that I was taught, but in reflecting on that now, it's like, well, yeah, the Jesus I was giving him didn't line up with the Jesus he was experiencing, and so I think bringing justice to situations is how then you can share the the truths from the scripture. You earn the right, if you will, to be able to do that, because then they begin to see Jesus for who he really is, because you're in there helping. And so I think that type of stuff, like evangelism explosion, the door to door sales, it came from a good place of wanting people to know about Jesus. Like, as a Christian, we want people to know about Jesus. That's why one of the key pillars here is evangelism. And I think, like any of these, every Christian group in the world would agree that evangelism is important, that social justice is important, and Christian justice is important. Um, but I think over the years, we kind of miss it. Our theology gets skewed, and I think too, like, people begin to deconstruct in this area because, well, let's go to kind of stuff we were involved in, like the missional versus attractional kind of mindset. I mean, I think in those environments, everything, people deconstruct because it becomes all about a number. I can remember being in a church, um, and I was evaluated based on the number of people that I was evangelizing to and getting to come to church or come to faith, and then we put that, as a pastor, then I put that on my volunteers, I put that on my people, like who you reaching out, and it just always becomes about the next person that's coming into our environment. And so then I think, get kind of lost in that, and we lose out on like actually loving people. People become a project rather than just a relationship, someone you relate to and love and care for. So yeah, that's something I've seen in that area that I think has caused people to definitely deconstruct.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, because we preach and teach Jesus, but the evangelicals, I think, we have narrowed so much this idea of what it means to preach and teach Jesus that we've narrowed it down to this idea of repentance and condemnation, which we translate as being this salvation, and then it's plus nothing. But then people become adults, mature, and they go and look at what Jesus actually said and what Jesus taught, and the balance between Jesus' repentance and condemnation talk versus Jesus' discussion of social issues, of the way you treat people, even the miracles. I mean, Jesus through the miracles is magnifying the stories of people who are oppressed, people who are blind, people who have leprosy, people who are crippled, or people who were cast out from society and ignored. And Jesus is advocating there on behalf of the least of these. And so we see that in scripture. We see Jesus doing that and match that up with what we're being told and how to live in faith by our faith communities. And it forces us into this state of deconstruction, because we begin to ask, well, is what I've been taught about the primary goals of the faith, does that really match up with what I see in Jesus? And a lot of people are looking at that and saying no. I think it's why a lot of adolescents walk away from their faith. The highest status, that somewhere around 80% of adolescents walk away from their faith in that transition into college and adulthood. Why do they do that? And by and large not come back? Because they get into college and they get into the world and they see that the world is living the story of Jesus better than the church, and how they treat other people. And so, well, okay, then I'm going to get involved with these other things that actually are living in a way that seems to mirror the way life should be lived. And then they look at the church and they say, I don't necessarily see that they're doing that in the same way. Why would I partner and spend my time and money in church whenever these other organizations are doing it better?
Yeah. In fact, there's an entire group of pastors, leaders in the church, Protestant evangelical church, that signed a document saying that social justice is not part of our call as Christians. And it became very public. And so if you have a group of perceived leaders in our community speaking that way, yeah, it's going to cause people to not want to come back to church. It's going to cause people never to want to step in the church and deconstruct and all of that. And yeah, and you look at Jesus, like he was all about justice. He was all about dealing with social issues. He was all about helping people, dealing with their real problems, meeting their real needs. He talked about it a lot in the scriptures, and just to ignore that, we do a disservice to Jesus. We miss a big part of Jesus. Like I always think about it this way. Like we, in that type of world, I grew up in that type of world. We celebrate the birth of Jesus, and we celebrate the death of Jesus, and we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, but we don't celebrate or look at the life that Jesus actually lived. We skip over that part. And so I think people need to recognize like the life of Jesus, and actually he showed us how to live. He showed us the best way it is to be human. And so if we live like Jesus lived, that's evangelism. That's what we're called to do. It's how we're called to be in the world. And people are going to want that. They're going to want Jesus in that way. Yeah. So I was thinking about this is like, I think that's why the Eucharist communion is so important, because we receive that the presence of Christ, we receive Christ through the bread and the cup, and then we go live that out. We are sent then to live Christ's presence out into the world. There's this like give and take of we receive Christ and we go live him out, like and those principles that we see at the table. We see, the compassion of Christ, we see the love of Christ, we see the grace, the forgiveness, and so we live those things out in the world, and we take care of our world. I can remember as a kid, like thinking I could litter. It was no big deal, right? Because it's all going to burn, burn to the ground anyway.
Armageddon, it's all going to be gone anyway, right?
And like my dad's still to this day, like has a hard time recycling, because he's like, it doesn't matter. It's like, there's this mentality that we don't got to take care of our world.
That's true though. Our theologies do drive that kind of thing. Yeah. I saw it, heard it, did it as well.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. So I think as we look at the life of Christ, then we're called to, as I said, we live that out in the world, but then that creates a lot of angst. Right. So as soon as we begin to live out Jesus, we realize that, wow, it's Black History Month. I should really like learn about Black history. And if I'm going to love my neighbor as Christ has called us to love, I have a lot of people of color neighbors. I've got to learn their story. I've got to learn their history. I've got to engage and say Black Lives Matter. I've got to celebrate Juneteenth with them. I've got to celebrate the things they celebrate, like learn their story, learn their history, so then I can enter in and practically love and care. And so when you start to say that, because that's what Jesus would do, it comes against the grain of that, because no one's looked at Jesus's life, and they'll say like, "Oh, Matt, you're getting political. Kevin, all you care about is politics." No, well,
yeah, no, yeah, you don't.
I care about politics, but not Democrat, Republican. I care about the politics, the way Jesus ordered his life, and I want to live that out in the world, right?
But people will say, Matt, I mean, devil's advocate, people say, Galatians 3:28, there's no Jew nor Gentile, there's no slave or free, we're all one race and one body. And so, the line that I hear used a lot whenever I say something about Black History Month or Black Lives Matter is that it's offensive to God and to faith to point out diversity. I wasn't going to answer that. I was hoping you... I have my thoughts, but that's the line. And I just, I mean, Jesus point the Good Samaritan. I mean, Jesus, Samaritan lives matter.
That a racist, whitewashed way of looking at that?
Well, I know it is, but this is a line. This is rhetoric that people hear, and it's attached to a verse, and it sounds it sounds good, but it's yeah. I think it smacks of racism and whitewashing. You know, my a lot of times the response that you get, you know, about I mean, I heard it this week. When was somebody suggested having, you know, we're celebrating Black History Month? Well, there's no White History Month. But, uh, what about racism towards white people? Well, okay, maybe we could talk about both. You know, I mean, if you want a White History Month, you know, okay. Uh, I have my thoughts about White History Month and reverse racism, but um, okay, if that's important to you in order to celebrate other races, for yours to be celebrated and affirmed, I mean, maybe there's a middle road here. You know, if you need that, then okay.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That passage, I mean, they look at it as, well, I don't have to care about black people. And really what that passage is saying is that we're all united. You know,
In our
that
differences.
that all of us are welcome at the table. Like there's unity here. And by and large in America, like we don't have that unity. There is Jew, there is Greek, because we do it the white way, and you must acquiesce
The
to
white
our
way.
way, you know?
No, I think that's I think that's pretty insightful, Matt. I want to make sure that we hear that, because what you've said is that that passage and that idea isn't, if I'm interpreting what you said correctly, isn't that God is wiping away our Jewishness or our Gentileness. He's not wiping away our maleness or our femaleness. He's not wiping away our freedom, our slavery. He's not wiping away our individuality. He's just saying that in our diversity and in our individuality, we can still be united. But that doesn't mean that those differences are ignored.
Yeah, and Paul was talking there too. I mean, there's the big argument about, especially in Galatians, about the circumcision stuff. You know, there was a big debate. If you're part of this faith, because it's a very Jewish faith, um, do you have to be circumcised, right? And Paul's saying, no, you don't have to be circumcised to be part of this faith, because we're all united. We all have our different cultural backgrounds. I, to me, that was the heart behind it. Not ignore, like to use that verse to like ignore the plight of our black brothers and sisters, the Native American, you know, that we just completely annihilated an entire race of people. Um, it does a complete disservice. It completely ignores it. It completely whitewashes the issue. Um, yeah, and it goes back to this theology of social justice and evangelism, because they don't, folks that like evangelism just praying a prayer to get out of hell, like don't see the need to deal with this issue. There's no Christian need. So like when you even argue from a Christian perspective that we should enter into this, they don't see the need for it. And it goes to, you know, all other sorts of issues. Immigration is another one. You know, refugees. Um, you know, trying to help those in poverty. You know, those in severe debt. Those in the help that, you know, helping educate those are undereducated get more educated. The list can I think go on and on. Healthcare system, like those without healthcare, helping. You know, how do we help them? Yesterday, I was flying home, and um, I think God kind of ordained this. Is like this family was flying to New York City, get off the plane with them, or they got. We had separate flights, but we arrived in the airport at the same time, and I must have looked like a friendly face because they came over to me and they barely spoke any English, and they're refugees from Haiti, um, trying to find, you know, their ride to get to the refugee center that they were headed to. And we were talking to each other through Google Translate and all that, and then, so I could kind of deduce, and so I was able to help him find, um, you know, his ride and that sort of thing. And I was just thinking about this family. Like so many Christians want to ignore this family, right? They would never want to help them, because they're, you know, whatever, because of our cultural politics. But I do think it's a view of what evangelism is and what social justice is, Christian activism is in the world. Their theology would never tell them to help this family, other than maybe giving them a pamphlet of how to get out of hell. Um, so yeah, there's just a lot of brokenness in that, I think, view that
Yeah,
leads to.
you've been you've said this, I think, several times over the last few weeks as we've been talking about these tenets of evangelicalism. Is that at one time evangelicalism was much more of a big tent movement that tried to bring in differences of opinion and perspectives and broadly accept people under those four tenets, rather than kind of try to push people out and make the boundaries small. It was larger. And I was thinking about this, and this week I ran across the Lausanne Covenant, which I think I had heard of but hadn't really looked into much. But just kind of proved, I think, the point of what you've been saying back in the early 70s, I think around 1974, John Stott, Billy Graham, a whole lot of evangelical leaders in those days kind of came together to kind of define a little bit what evangelicalism means and put in place some sort of a mousetrap, I guess, to reach the rest of the world evangelistically with the message and the story of Christ. But it was interesting as I was kind of reading about this Lausanne Covenant, which at this point is what? It's almost 50 years old. That it was just fascinating to me to see where we are now in evangelicalism. At that point, it was trying to write covenants and agreements to bring people together. But then you see just a few years later the rise of the moral majority, the religious right, and then all these other statements like the one you talked about a few minutes ago. You see the Nashville statement, you see the Chicago statement on biblical inerrancy, you see the Danvers statement, you see the Dallas statement, all of these things that are trying to narrow what it means to be an evangelical, and also now narrow what it means to be a Christian or inside the kingdom of God, and split off anybody who disagrees on biblical authority, on gender and sexuality and all these other things. And it just, the fracturing over these things is huge. But all of that to say, one of the greatest disagreements, even back in the Lausanne Covenant in '74, was social justice, social action. It caused a disagreement between Stott and Graham. It was secondary to evangelism, but it was a big source of contention even back then. What is the place of social justice? What's the place of social action? And they came to an agreement then, but I think that now, fast forward, there's a whole lot of disagreement now over whether or not we should be involved at any level in social justice and social action and oppression. In fact, I think in a lot of ways, I would say at least that we are the oppressor as Christians here in America, of people who Jesus spoke strongly on behalf of in the Gospels. And it's disappointing at the least, and I think offensive to God at the worst.
Yeah, I was talking with someone this week, and they're Native American, and they were saying that America is Rome. Like, we were, like, as they read the Bible, they see themselves as the oppressed, that Jesus, and the Jews really being oppressed, and so they can really identify with that people group in the scriptures. And that struck me. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, we are Rome. And I liked how you narrowed it even down further to Christians are Rome, that we are oppressing, and it's so true. We're called to love people, and we do some of the most unloving things to people by in our theology. Your theology should always lead to love. And then, of course, they'll say, well, you're being unloving, but not telling them the truth, And we really need a hell podcast, because I think it always goes back to the hell thing. It's like,
it does. Hell drives so much more of our theology than I've given it credit for.
yeah, it's it's fascinating to me though that when you read the Bible, and that's I think a big problem that a lot of our culture has with the church is like you read the Bible, you read about Jesus, and you're like, I like that guy, I like what he's about, but then the church doesn't do any of those things, you know.
No, I was having this discussion this week. Okay, he gets us this new campaign that's out. That's $1 billion campaign. It's getting a whole bunch of press. Super Bowl that's coming up is going to feature several He Gets Us commercials. There was one in the Grammys over the weekend, which the Grammys is a whole other conversation. But it's funded by a group that is anonymous, but seems to be like the Hobby Lobby folks. And it's just this huge marketing campaign about Jesus to create this image of Jesus who understands you. And so you call up this He Gets Us line after you see this commercial, and you can receive prayer, you can get connected with a church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I had somebody reach out to me, a reporter, and said, "Do you want to comment on this?" And I was kind of talking through some of the things we've talked through. That the church is by and large having problems in the U.S., that people are walking away from the church. And this He Gets Us campaign, they were like, do you think this He Gets Us campaign is going to fix any of those things? And I was like, to your point that you just said, Jesus doesn't have an image problem in the U.S. Like, they're putting all of this PR into Jesus, and Jesus gets you, and Jesus understands you. People love Jesus. He doesn't need his image fixed. He doesn't need a $1 billion marketing campaign to fix him. The problem is his followers in the church. Like, you need to be dumping billions and billions of dollars into fixing your image, or just fixing the issues that are driving your negative image, rather than Jesus. Like, nobody has an issue with Jesus. This is a waste of money. It's nobody's walked away from Jesus. They've walked away from his church.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
it's because of this social justice issue, the social action, the way that we have interacted socially in the world has been highly negative, to the point of being toxic and caustic. And it is killing our witness. And I don't want to say that it's killing Jesus or the faith. I think that God is stronger than anything that the church can mess up. And yet, I think it has a huge effect on people. And it's easy to understand why people would hate the church, would hate Christians, because of, on this fourth tenet, the way we've handled this fourth tenet. He gets us, Jesus gets us, but the church doesn't, I don't think, at all.
No, that's great. Yeah, there's been a quite a number of books written that way over the years. I love Jesus, but I hate your church. And I think it's so true. And those in that view that you ignore Jesus's life, that you ignore this whole social action, like you do us, the broader Christian world, a disservice. And let's be honest, like stepping into social justice issues does get messy. It can be hard. It You're not always going to do the right thing in the right way, but I think as long as we're like kind of slowly like moving forward in that, I think the world will notice that. The world will be excited about it. Where I was going with that. So, some social justice organizations don't like it when a church comes to help, and I want to talk to pastors a little bit here, as we do have this. We are Rome, right? We have this mentality that we can do it better, and especially the larger the church you are. Because I remember being at a larger church, and we always thought we could do everything better. Um, and so when you go in these situations, you want to help. Um, a lot of these organizations don't want your help because you're just going to try to tell them how to do it better. When they've been on the ground doing this for decades and decades and decades, they know what they're doing. And then we as a church somehow come in and say, we're going to fix all your problems when, and so just submit, find an organization to partner with and submit to what they've learned, submit to how they're doing it. And so I was talking to somebody recently, and they said they cringe when they hear church groups want to help.
No.
So we even have a bad reputation for even when we do want to help. So there's a lot to, I think, unravel, a lot of layers to the onion too. So I think walking in a posture of humility, because there's probably pastors out there, leaders, churches that want to get involved in social justice issues. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, I'd encourage you not to. I'd encourage you just to go find and partner with an organization that's been doing it,
Yeah.
learning and growing.
So
You
I was
know,
going to ask you, was that like an international mission, or was that like a local backyard mission?
local. Well, yeah.
It
I mean, it
was.
could be both.
Yeah, well, no,
The
because
person I was,
most of the time, churches, larger churches, getting involved internationally is so much easier than getting involved, for the oppressed locally. Because the politics, it's a whole lot easier to go to um, another country in order to work on their problems than it is to admit that in your own backyard there are refugees, there are people who need equal rights, there are poor areas that can use assistance, but
yeah,
so many churches, so many Christians avoid, I think, those things, frankly, just because of our politics rather than our faith. It's how many Christians are going to hold to a stringent view of LGBT theologies, but yet still fight on behalf of equal rights for those people. It's difficult to do, and when we don't, I think it says a lot about. I mean, Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000, one of our favorite miracles. Jesus is feeding people, a whole bunch of people who probably didn't need the food that he was given to him. And when you think the whole feeding of the 5,000, the background of this is Jesus goes out into the desert. Well, the timing of when Jesus goes out into the desert was essentially the place and the time that people would go before Passover in order to plan insurrections against Rome during Passover week. So Jesus goes with his disciples out into the desert. Well, everybody follows him there, 5,000 people, because they think Jesus is about to form an insurrection. So they're there for the wrong reasons. And what does Jesus do? Jesus feeds the insurrectionists.
hmm.
He feeds people who he was at odds with theologically and practically, but still social justice. He still lives out his faith in a way that is helping people who are in need of help in that moment, no matter what they think, no matter what they believe, no matter what their plans are. And the church has a really difficult time being magnanimous and living out the life and the actions of a Jesus who sees your humanity and your need before he sees your theology.
That's good. I think, um, yeah, I think you've got it. I think the evangelism of Jesus, the call to Christian activism, I think is to, be Christ's presence to your neighbors. Like I think there's something to, getting involved in a local organization. Like the one I was referring to earlier was they were helping people in recovery, and then also get back on their feet, like after they were incarcerated. Um, so there's things like that you could get involved with. There's a guy in our church that helps, teenage moms who are homeless, get back on their feet. Figure out how to get jobs, if they have drug addiction. That's something that we're looking at as a church to get partnered with, more involved with. So there's things like that are good. International trips are the easy ones, right? It's more of like the Christian tourism where you can get people you can raise money and basically go for free, to see other countries and build a house or two. Those have their place, but the hardest one I think is like the third tier. If you have the international, you have the local organizations you partner with. The third one, which I think is the call of Christ, is to actually then live out Christ in your neighborhood and find areas that need to be served there. Like you find out your neighbor needs something and you can enter into that space, and I live in a very diverse part of the country. And so part of that is getting to know the stories of the oppressed, getting to know the stories of the neighborhood, and seeking justice in those areas. And that can be really hard because now you're like in it with people, right? You're grinding with people, and like you can discover things like I discovered right across the street here. I can see the house where the local KKK leader lived, right? And the KKK had a group out of my town. And so then you find that out through story and conversation, and you realize, wow, my community has deep roots of racism. And then you start to address some of that to seek repentance, and people don't like that, right? There's
No,
there's a lot, right? It
no.
gets
Well,
messy.
and I think that's how you know whenever you are actually now living out this call of Jesus, social action, Jesus bringing justice in a place, is whenever people start to get uncomfortable about what you're doing, you are finally at the place where you are, I think, living out the true call of Jesus to his followers. Not that all these other things, international missions or local missions, or giving money to something, doesn't have some positive effect. But I think, at the end of the day, what has the most effect on individuals and what has the most return for us spiritually is, as you said, being actively involved in your neighborhood one to one on on the issues and the needs that are there. And you start doing that, and you're right, you're going to start to see some of that pushback from people, which is what happened to Jesus as well.
Yeah, it's a I think it's a beautiful way to live. It can be very frustrating on one side, but then one side is there's beauty in it, like as you help people that have real needs. And a lot of folks, like in our neighborhoods, aren't going to just naturally express their needs. Like you're not going to get to know the needs in your neighborhood until you get to know these people. Um, and because a lot of Americans, a lot of humans in general, we like to hide what we're really going through. Um, and we put these facades on, and you can get past all of that and help and start to meet real needs in your neighborhoods when you do that. Um, and then people they want, like, I don't have to convince when I like I'm just thinking about a few families that have started coming to our church, and it's like I didn't like and come to Christ, and I didn't like have some master evangelism plan for them. I just loved them and helped meet some of their needs practically, and they just started coming, right? Like they wanted more of Jesus. They wanted Jesus. That, like, to me, and that's how Jesus, I think, got a lot of his followers. Like he just people just wanted to be around him. And I think when we live this kind of life, people just want more of it. They truly do. Or they reject Jesus, right? Jesus obviously was crucified, and I've seen that too as I live this out. People reject the way of Jesus, and they're gone, which is hard, especially when you're building relationships and things are very personal. Um, but yeah, I think you're gonna get both.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't see many people rejecting Jesus, and maybe I was trying to because they did reject Jesus. I was trying to think, did they reject Jesus, or did they reject the idea of Jesus that they had in their mind? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I think a lot of times we say that the community is rejecting Jesus when really they're just rejecting the messenger who is acting like an asshole, not acting like Jesus. There, I've said it.
Well, yeah, I see what you're saying. That is very true. Like,
You can say it's wrong.
folks like
It's okay.
no, folks like Driscoll. I see where you're headed with it, but I think, I think, I do think though there's times where people have the wrong image of who Jesus is,
Okay.
and then you show them Jesus, and they don't like it, right? They don't want to get involved in loving certain kinds of people. They don't,
Ah,
they're happy with where they're at, and they don't like that Jesus is challenging them
Yeah.
to
So it's
grow.
not outsiders necessarily always that have the wrong view of Jesus. It's insiders who have the wrong view of Jesus and what it's about. And whenever we're presented with who Jesus really is and what he wants us to do, um, for some of us, that's just a bridge too far. I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's why a lot of times in our discussions on Twitter, people don't want to discuss Jesus. They just want to discuss like Paul, you know, because I think they reject this side of Jesus that doesn't fit with their theology. And a lot of those discussions are with theobros, so they would never say they reject Jesus. Um, but I've
Well, they
seen
don't have
people,
to because the theology they've written their theology essentially that Jesus wrote Paul. Through the
yeah,
doctrine of inerrancy and the fact the
that's
scripture
correct.
is
Yeah,
God breathed. Essentially,
yeah,
the thinking is that Jesus's voice literally spoke into Paul's hand as he wrote, and so it holds equal value. And so Jesus may not have said it, but Paul did. And I understand the theology behind that, but I also think that's a pretty dangerous theology if Jesus was completely and absolutely silent, or maybe even opposite of Paul's thinking on an issue. I think it's pretty shaky ground.
yeah. That's dangerous, right? Um, just thinking about the implications of that. Yeah, you could use you could use that thought process to reject Jesus. Because Paul was after Jesus, and so one could say, well, Jesus through Paul was clarifying what he meant, you know. Um, and yeah, it gets dangerous when you look at it that way. But obviously, I think a lot of these people know. I mean, even the people I've experienced, and I don't think and I think your point's well taken that they may be just rejecting the messenger and not the message. But I've seen people where it's like you present them Jesus they've never seen or heard because no one's ever talked about it because they just talk about Paul. They don't talk about these things and they don't like what that Jesus is saying and calling them to until they reject it. So maybe they're obviously maybe don't like me as well, so they reject me. That point's well taken. But I think people are confronted with Jesus and they're like, oh, I don't like that. Um,
Yeah, well, and I don't think that Paul and Jesus personally are at odds much, or if at all. But frankly, the Theobros and the folks who focus on Paul to the exclusion of Jesus do so essentially because they have misquoted and mistheologized Paul, and so it's taken them down a road where they've taken Jesus and God to the place that they want Jesus and God to go because they've misquoted Paul. Paul's the easiest guy to twist, rather than starting with Jesus and saying Paul has to match with Jesus rather than Jesus match with Paul.
yeah, yeah. I think that's good. I mean, I think our first podcast we talked about this hermeneutic, this Jesus hermeneutic. Um, that I think as you read Scripture, everything's got to go through the lens of Jesus and what he was about, what he taught, what he did, how he lived his life. Including here when we talk about evangelism, Christian activism. I, I don't know how you can get past. I don't know how I know we've talked about it, I know how they do, but just intellectually, how do you ignore Jesus in the area of Christian activism and social justice? But people do it constantly.
Yeah, no, I think you have to, ignore is the right word. I think you have to absolutely outright intentionally ignore it, especially the deeper you get in the faith. I think you have to intentionally outright ignore it. People who are young and new in the faith, in my experience, tend to see and understand social justice and social action and what Jesus is saying. But then a lot of Paulites end up, convincing that, and theology in a lot of ways is fun. We enjoy understanding where the boundaries are and going in and defining what's in and what's out and those things. It's a human fleshly, it's an enjoyable experience. And so I think it takes us to a place that's far and away from where Jesus actually is. And I think you end up, like you said, having to ignore a tremendous amount of the way Jesus lived and what Jesus said in order to get to a place where not only are you not living a life centered around social justice and social action as being primary to your faith, but where you actually feel as though it's counterproductive or against God to do so, requires a whole lot of ignoring the text.
Yeah. Yeah, so much so they won't. I mean, when I'm in these dialogues with folks, they won't ever refer to Jesus. It's always they just want to ignore Jesus. Yeah, it's always the Bible says. It's the Paul says. It's um, those are the two main things, but it's never Jesus says, right? Um, and so, yeah, it's frustrating to interact with that. It's two different distinct views on our place in the world and how we live it out. To me, the one side of it, you're causing a lot of people to deconstruct and leave the faith and never enter into the faith. And I think those that are deconstructing um, want to figure out how to live like Jesus in the world. I mean, I have conversations all the time asking about that, who people are on the process of deconstructing, and they want to know more about how to live like Jesus in the world today. Like they have no clue for it, no concept of it, because they've been in this evangelical bubble for so long that's never taught them anything. Um, I've been coaching some pastors in some of this, and I had to create a document on how to make friends with non-Christians or people not in the church, because people are hungry for it and they just don't know how to do it. So I literally created a document how to make friends.
We're so disconnected.
Yeah.
I mean, we are.
It's
We're
sad.
insulated from the world. I truly think that so many of our social justice and social action um, things would be solved if we would sit around the table with folks who were not inside the kingdom of heaven. And you might even find that the people who you thought that weren't were. Whenever you sit down and have a conversation, invite them to your house. Invite them out to dinner. Begin to share meals and conversations with people who are not in your inner circle of Christians, and I think you will hear needs and see needs that you will be so compelled to fulfill that you will find after just a few of those conversations that you have become a a social justice warrior and an advocate for the needs of the people and the problems in your communities. I'm just truly convinced that people who, and in my experience, this has been true. Maybe not everyone, I'll qualify that, but by and large, I'm convinced that the people who are against social justice or social action have literally zero connection or conversations with people who are outside of their faith stream. I just don't
Yeah.
think you can be in your neighborhood or in your community or in conversations with people who are not followers of Jesus Christ in the traditional sense and not be a social advocate, not be doing justice work.
I totally agree. I mean, when I started to, I don't want to use the word woke, but
Wake
when
up.
I started, when I started
I
to
started to
wake
wake up,
up, become awakened to
come
some of these
alive,
things,
started following
um,
Jesus. What are the
yeah, that's good. I started following Jesus. I realized,
Let's gaslight the people out there a little bit with
yeah,
the terms we use.
I realized that I, I never spent any time with anybody outside of my bubble. Um, and it was a pretty tight bubble. It was mostly just other pastors and leaders in my church. And I had because of that, I had no time for anyone else. And so yeah, I didn't know my neighbors. I didn't know the stories in my neighborhood. I didn't know the issues, and it made me depressed. I was like, really sad that I had lived in a neighborhood for 4 or 5 years and knew no one. And so we had begun to move, and so I committed that I was not going to do that again, and I'm glad I did. So yeah, I agree, and it's easy to get sucked into that. And I think, yeah, as soon as you get to know the story of your neighborhood, your heart begins to break for it, and you want to engage, and you want to love, you want to care. Um, I think the Holy Spirit, even those folks that signed the statement, if they would just get to know their neighborhood, they would their heart would begin to break, for those folks and want to help them. And I sent you a video yesterday of one of the leaders, pastors out there that clearly doesn't get to know the queer community, and he's just speaking out and preaching out against the queer community and how it's evil. And it's like, I just kept thinking, like, well, why don't you just get to know what instead of this? Why don't you just go get to know one queer person that's going to show up? Maybe just show up to that event, the queer event he was blasting, and just get to know their story and begin to then enter into that world. If you think they need help, then why do you think screaming at him is going to help them? He probably doesn't think they need help, but they're just all evil and devils. Anyways, um, shifting gears a bit as we come to our hour, what are some things I thought we would talk about a little bit? Ways in which we can get churches, if like pastors and leaders or even individuals, ways in which we could become more active in our world. Kind of some low hanging fruit ideas. I know you've done some stuff, got involved in your community, that might be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the local schools, the local public schools is a great place in the community. We live in an area where there are several Title IX schools who struggle. Kids show up and they have an accident at school and they don't have any replacement clothes, and so the school keeps on hand socks, underwear, some extra clothes for kids. And so we found that out, and we said that we would help fund and be a part of making sure that they have stuff there. They're not able to buy it with school funds. I think conversations, one of the things right now that churches, I think especially in Christians, can do is this tension between the LGBTQ community and Christianity is huge. And so beginning to learn and understand, trans especially seems to be the T in the LGBTQ, the place where there's just a whole lot of heat right now. Identifying and getting to know and have conversations with people who identify in that way. Now, you may say, I don't know anybody in my community that identifies in that way. Well, that's your fault. Start getting to know people in your community, and you will find, build relationships, not for the express intent of evangelism, but simply to just build relationships in your community and learn. The church does a woeful job right now of doing that, unfortunately, and just as I'm tossing grenades over brick walls at people, rather than getting to know true children of God. Instead, we've made caricatures of a whole lot of people. I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, that was good stuff. I think doing some research on your community, like our mentor Leonard Sweet always talked about, what's important to the community is what the community is centered around. And so I found that to be a helpful tool. So like, you literally just get a map out and look at the map and see like what's your community built around. And for most suburban, neighborhood communities, it's built around schools and parks and, sports fields. So, build bridges into your community. So yeah, it like my community here, it's built around schools. So getting involved with the schools and finding needs, we've done that. Getting involved in this kids sports programs, helping out there. You find a lot of need through that as well. Just, kids can't afford certain things. And so being able to provide that. Um, and then I would say too, is like, as you learn about your community and you learn the needs, like something that I've been processing is doing kind of like micro pilgrimages, like taking your people like practically to different sites in your community to kind of tell the story historically of issues, whether it be racism or prejudices against the LGBTQI community, or just in general poverty, maybe reasons why there is poverty in your community, why there's brokenness, maybe drug addiction, all those things. Like learning those stories of why, and then taking your people through kind of a micro pilgrimage through a few sites that's probably readily available, or you could just create it. But as you learn the story, go to a park or whatever, have conversations, I think will help get you thinking about ways in which you can serve your community. So I always think of what are some easy bridges to enter into the community and get involved and start finding needs.
I like that,
Those are some
actually.
thoughts on
I was thinking as you were talking, less time at church, more time in your community. I mean, we all have a finite amount of time, and we feel compelled to use that singing in the choir, being on a church board, leading a class or a small group, having our kids in a midweek program at the church, or if you are in a larger church, church sports programs, be on a community board. Sing as a part of a community organization or a community theater troupe. Get your kids involved in your local city sports rather than your church sports. So I think, using the finite time that you have to intentionally involve and invest yourself into your community rather than just more deeply into your worship environment, for a lot of us, may be the primary thing that's missing in our faith.
Agreed. One of the best things I've done as a pastor here is I joined the local YMCA board, and it's not that hard to join a board. Yeah. Because they're volunteer organizations. And so if you're willing
Young
to
man.
volunteer some time, they're not going to turn you away.
It's fun to stay at the YMCA, I hear.
Yeah. Yeah. So good stuff. And thanks for joining us today on another episode of Jacked Theology.
So I'm almost afraid to ask about the fitness and the workout. Though you've been doing better than me. Now I have an excuse. I was in the hospital for the better part of the week, so it was amazing though in the hospital. It was, boy, hospital food has come a long way. Like they give you this menu and you go through and you can choose as much as you want or as little as you want, and it's amazing food. And so I ate all the carbs, all the desserts. No workout, and I'm thinking I'm going to get back home after this 3 or 4 day hospital stay, and I am going to have put on 5 or 10 pounds. And I was thankful to have I actually lost 2 pounds from when I weighed beforehand, but I'm guessing all of that was probably muscle. But either way, I was so thankful that the weight did not go up on the scale, because I ate all the things, and it was good.
You got to feed your feelings, man, when you're in the
That
hospital.
you know, absolutely.
I remember when the unlimited thing was great because when I would visit Kelly in the hospital and she had her few stays, she'd always order me food too with it, and I'd have the second meal she ordered. Yeah, I was away this week. Unfortunately, I was in the hospital like you. It was a little pastors get together for a network. I'm a communion, I guess. It's Anglican communion, and it was good to be with them and get to know their story better, and learn some things about liturgy and all that, which is great. Another podcast sometime we'll talk about liturgy. That'd be fun.
That would
But
be.
yeah, no, I fitness one day. I got one day
Hey,
at
well,
a
more than me.
YMCA. We're members at YMCA locally, and so I'm able to use YMCA's all over the country. So I popped in, and the first day, and after that, I wasn't able to. So yeah, I too I maintained my weight. I was happy with that. I did not eat well, but um, I think I don't know why, but I fortunately broke even. That was the goal, so I met the goal, and now it's back to the grind. So back home and
Yeah. So,
grinding again.
I mean, I guess we all have those weeks, those times where you just gotta, it is what it is. Life happens. You gotta
Yeah.
get back on the routine again.
Well, that's the key. That's the key. You can't let a few days of laziness or recovery from health issue.
You can't let the hospital keep you down. Come on, man.
You gotta get it back. You gotta get back to it.
I have to admit, though, I think I'm going to. I think I'm going to milk this recovery thing for as long as I can because I'm thinking some banana pudding today, a nice roast beef sub. I'll start Monday back on the Monday.
Well, that's true. We got the Super Bowl on Sunday. I was thinking
That's
about
right.
that.
Super Bowl's coming up on Sunday. There's really no reason to try and know I'm going to fail again within 24 hours. So, yeah, I'll start Mondays. Super Bowl Monday.
I'm with you. We'll start Monday.
Who's going to win the Super Bowl?
I got to root for the Eagles. My son's an Eagles fan since we lived in Philly country for a few years.
Yeah.
He became a fan, so I'll root with my son for the Eagles. I don't care.
Yeah, well, I'm always rooting for the commercials. I'm one of those guys because I'm more of an NCAA football guy. College is my thing. I don't follow pro at all, but I pay attention to the Super Bowl because of the commercials. So I'm always rooting for the commercials.
American High Holy Day.
That's absolutely, and this year I get to celebrate a Jesus who gets me. As a part of the commercials, so I'm going to count this as church attendance.
Do you think there'll be devils on the halftime show? I really hope there is.
Do you really want to go there? Do we really want to go there and talk about Sam Smith and Kim Petras? Really? There are devils everywhere, I'm told, Matt. Everywhere. Behind every corner lurks Satan. At least anything that I enjoy. We need some bumper stickers to say that. Everything I enjoy is satanic.